Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into two of the most stigmatized and honestly most misunderstood conditions in all of psychology, schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder. Now, you've probably heard them used interchangeably, but as we're about to see, they could not be more different. So let's just get right to it and tear down the biggest myth from the get-go. The word schizophrenia literally means split mind, and that one little phrase, that's where all the confusion starts, because almost everyone gets the meaning wrong. And here it is, the most important thing to get straight. The split in schizophrenia is not a split personality. It is a split from reality. A split in identity, well, that belongs to a totally different condition, dissociative identity disorder. And we'll circle back to that one later. If you can just lock this one distinction in your mind, everything else we're about to talk about will make so much more sense. Okay, so if it's not multiple personalities, then what is it? What does a split from reality actually look like or feel like for the person who's going through it? Let's break it down. First off, it's not just one thing. We now think of it as a whole spectrum of disorders, but the main defining feature is that a person loses contact with reality. This leads to what experts call psychotic symptoms, and that can mess with how a person thinks, how they feel, and how they see the world, which, as you can imagine, makes just getting through a normal day incredibly hard. To make sense of it all, psychologists usually group the symptoms into three big buckets, but the names they use, positive and negative, are a little weird, a little counterintuitive. So let's unpack what they really mean. First up, we have positive symptoms. Now, when you hear positive, you think good, right? Well, not here. In a clinical sense, positive just means the addition of something, symptoms that are added on top of a person's normal experience. So this is where you get things like hallucinations, which are sensory experiences that aren't really there, like hearing voices when you're all alone. It also includes delusions, which are these really powerful false beliefs that a person holds onto, no matter what evidence you show them. This quote absolutely nails what the most common type of hallucination, hearing voices, might feel like. I mean, think about that. That little voice in your head, your own thoughts. Imagine if it suddenly sounded like it was coming from someone else, from right outside your body. You can see how disorienting and frankly how terrifying that would be. You know, movies and TV shows often jump to this idea that delusions always lead to violence, but that's a huge misconception. The reality is way, way more complicated. In fact, some of the most brilliant minds, like the mathematician John Nash, you might know him from the movie A Beautiful Mind, made these incredible contributions to the world all while living with this disorder. Okay, so if positive symptoms are about adding things, you can probably guess what negative symptoms are. They're the opposite. It's about subtracting things, the absence or the toning down of normal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. This can show up as a kind of emotional flatness, a toneless voice or a face that doesn't show much expression. It can look like someone pulling away from their friends and family, losing interest in things they used to love, or just not being able to take care of basic stuff like personal hygiene. And that brings us to the last bucket, disorganized symptoms. This is exactly what it sounds like, a jumble of fragmented thinking that can make having a conversation almost impossible. It can lead to something that's vividly called word salad, where a person's speech just becomes this string of disconnected, meaningless words. It's a really stark reflection of the chaos happening inside their mind. So, we've got a clearer picture of the symptoms, but what in the world is happening in the brain to cause all this? Well, science is pointing to a few key ideas. One of the biggest theories revolves around a neurotransmitter you've probably heard of, dopamine. The basic idea is that folks with schizophrenia might have way too many dopamine receptors, which makes their brains kinda hyper-responsive. It's like it cranks up the volume on brain activity, which could be what creates those positive symptoms like hallucinations, as the brain just can't tell the difference between its own signals and what's coming from the outside world. And then there's the genetic piece, which is just undeniable. For anyone in the general population, the risk is about 1%. But if you have a parent or a sibling with a disorder, that number jumps to 10%. And get this, if your identical twin has it, it's literally a coin flip, a 50% chance. That points to a really powerful genetic link. But hold on, it's not just about genes. That's not the whole picture. The leading idea today is something called the diathesis stress model. It's a fancy name, but the idea is simple. Think of it this way. Your genetics might load the gun, but it's an environmental factor, like intense stress or a traumatic event, that actually pulls the trigger. It's that classic combination of nature and nurture. Okay, so now we can see that schizophrenia is this really complex brew of biology and environment, creating this break in how a person experiences reality. So now let's finally turn our attention back to that other split, the one in identity, and the condition it's so often confused with. Unlike schizophrenia, which is fundamentally a disorder of thought, DID is a disorder of consciousness. It's defined by this profound break in a person's awareness, their memory, and their very sense of self. And this can lead to a person showing two or even more totally distinct identities that can each take the driver's seat at different times. You really can't talk about the modern history of DID without talking about a book called Sybil. It was pitched as a true story about a woman with 16 different personalities, and it became a massive cultural phenomenon. But the whole story had this unbelievable twist. Decades later, it came out that the patient at the center of it all admitted she had faked the whole thing. The impact of that book was just staggering. Before Sybil, a DID diagnosis was incredibly rare. I'm talking fewer than 100 documented cases in history. After the book and the movie came out, that number exploded to nearly 40,000. It's a wild example of how a powerful story can shape not just what the public believes, but what happens in a doctor's office, too. Okay, so after hearing about a massive psychological hoax like that, it's totally understandable that a lot of people, including a lot of psychologists, started asking a really tough question. Is DID a real disorder at all? Or is it maybe just a product of our culture, of suggestion? The debate is still very much alive, but there is some pretty compelling evidence on the other side. Some studies have found real, measurable physical changes between a person's different identities, like distinct brainwave patterns, or even changes in which hand is dominant. Some ophthalmologists have even detected different eyesight prescriptions between identities. It suggests that, for some people, this might be a very real, though very extreme, way of coping with unbelievable trauma. Whew, okay. We've covered a lot of ground, from the inner workings of schizophrenia to the controversy around DID. So after all of that, what's the big idea? What are we supposed to take away from all this? I think it really all boils down to this. These conditions are complicated, and yeah, they can sound frightening, but by actually taking the time to move past the myths and the Hollywood portrayals, we can start to replace all that confusion and fear with something much more useful: compassion. And it really forces us to ask ourselves a pretty important question. When someone's reality starts to break, is our first instinct to judge them, or is it to try and understand?